All right. Well, thanks everybody for jumping on the call this morning. We really appreciate your attendance. I think we can kick today's agenda into gear. Um, for those who don't know me, I'm Commissioner Nicholas Ucci of the Office of Energy Resources. And joining me today are several members of the Office of Energy Resources team, including Dr. Kerry Gill, Yasmin Yacobi, Shorta Beelan, Chris Kearns, and others. As well as our consultants, fantastic consultants, I might add, the Brattle Group team led by Dr. D. Murphy, Dr. Jurgen Weiss, and Michael Haggerty, as well as Ellen Powell, who's behind the scenes making sure that this runs very smoothly. And we will do our best to make that happen. Today's agenda includes two parts. The first is we'll turn the mic over to Brattle, and they will walk through updated and fresh analytical insights. We'll take about a 10-minute break once we get through that section, and we anticipate that to be around 11:20, but may go short or long depending on discussion. And we'll take up the second half of the agenda today for OER to talk through some of the policy, programmatic, and equity recommendations that we have begun to develop. And we'll conclude with some Q&A for those who have joined us in the past. We have a couple of opportunities for Q&A. One is written through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We ask that you use the Q&A feature and not the chat feature. And we'll also, as a team, be fielding the questions that come through that, responding both in writing as well as reserving some of those questions to have some discussion. So we'll tee those up and talk through our responses to those. Next slide, Ellen. Great. So if you'll indulge me, I just have a few remarks. We're coming to the end of this public process, but I want to note that our work will certainly continue. The governor has asked us to deliver a final report and recommendations by the end of December, and we are on track to do that. And then we begin the hard but important work of executing on the policy, programmatic, and equity-centric recommendations, which we will discuss during today's workshop. Along with the questions fielded today, we welcome you to submit additional comment over the next 2 weeks. Details on how to do that will be shared shortly. As this is our last technical public workshop, there are some folks that I would like to thank. First, joining us today are representatives of the governor's staff and that of the lieutenant governor. Also, we've had regular participation by Rhode Island House and Senate policy staff, as well as some members of the General Assembly and from Senator Whitehouse's office. We appreciate their collective attention to this very important work. I also want to thank all of the industry-based organizations and participants who have shared valuable data and insights on trends in the renewable market. Also, I want to thank National Grid, which has been engaged throughout this initiative and has supported us with data and other insights. I would be remiss not to spotlight the incredible collaboration shown by the Department of Environmental Management, Public Utilities Commission, and the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers. We have all met as a group more times than I can count, I think, to talk through project analytics and its implications for achieving Rhode Island's clean energy future. I am thankful for their participation and expertise, as well as that of my own incredible team at the Office of Energy Resources. The Brattle team, Dean, Michael, Jurgen, Ellen, they've all been a fantastic partner in this work. Just as they were during our heating sector transformation effort earlier this year. So I want to thank them as well. And finally, all of you, our Rhode Island stakeholders from the general public, environmental advocacy groups, industry, the public sector, state agencies, universities, and yes, even the media, which I know has also been following this work. If we know anything about achieving our decarbonization goals, it is that it will take all of us, citizens, businesses, industry, government, and others to make it happen. We are on the front lines of climate change. There's no doubt about it. There is no greater challenge to our way of life or to our shared environment. So your attendance and participation reflects how far we have come as a society to recognize these stark realities, as well as the commitment we all make to meet the challenges in front of us. So thank you. And with that, let's get into the agenda. Very briefly, you've seen this slide several times. If you've joined us in the past, a reminder that the governor signed an executive order back in January, challenging the state to meet 100% of its electricity demand with renewable energy by 2030. That launched this effort in coordination with the Brattle Group and several state agencies to conduct analytical and policy analysis and develop pathways to achieving the governor's goal. And as I mentioned, we are on track to deliver the analytical results and an actionable plan by the end of December. Here's the timeline of how we got to today. Won't spend a lot of time here other than to note that we do intend to hold 2 more community listening sessions. Now, those sessions are designed to be less technical than today. It's really some additional opportunity to hear from the community, hear from all of you, and to hopefully educate and bring folks up to speed. We know how challenging some of this energy terminology can be. And so we've set up a series of community listening sessions to provide additional forum for our citizens to react and respond to this work, as well as to try and clarify where it's required. So notice on how to join those community listening sessions will be sent out shortly. I believe they're scheduled for the 10th and the 14th. And we look forward to engaging with you during those opportunities. Next slide. Here's our website. We post all our workshop materials there, and we'll certainly post the final report there once it's complete. And public comment. So for the next 2 weeks, thereabouts, we welcome written public comment. Our office email is listed there on the screen. Please, we've received some great comments so far, and it has helped us think through some of the challenges. I would encourage all of you, to the extent that you want to continue the conversation beyond today, to please send us your thoughts and insights. The state project team, I mentioned, the agencies earlier on, but here's a full list of the folks who have most deeply been engaged on this work on behalf of the state of Rhode Island. And with that, I think I can turn it over to you, Dean, and the Brattle Group to begin the analytical portion of today's workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ucci. I'd like to say our own thanks to the entire Rhode Island component of this project team at the Office of Energy Resources, the DPUC, the PUC, the Department of Environmental Management, as well as at our colleagues at National Grid, and the participation of all the stakeholders who have participated through stakeholder interviews, these prior workshops, submitting comments. It has all been incredibly helpful to our work. Let's jump ahead to the next slide and just say a word or two about logistics. A reminder, this webinar is being recorded. By default, everyone other than the panelists will be muted. We will have an opportunity for Q&A at the break in the middle and again at the end. We ask that you, if you have a question, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar screen. If you're connected only by phone, you can press *9 to be recognized and allowed to speak during the Q&A sessions. Reminder, if you're speaking, please identify yourself by your name and your organization. If you have any technical questions about the webinar logistics, send a chat through the webinar to Ellen Powell, who is our host. And if you can't figure out your questions through the webinar, if you're not able to connect, send an email to ellenpowell@brattle.com. That's ellen.powell, P-A-A-L, @brattle.com. We will have an approximately 10-minute break. We will shoot to have that at about 11:20, reconvening at around 11:30. So if we can jump ahead to the agenda. Very quick overview. We're going to start out with just a very brief recap of the first two workshops and where we've been before now, and then get into a little more detail on the ratepayer cost impact. You saw that last time at the second workshop. We've revised some of those analyses, so we want to show you that. And then we'll get into the economic impact analysis. We gave a preview of that last time, but didn't have results to show you, and now we do. I think they're very interesting. So we'll do that for the same bookend portfolios that we've talked about up till now, and then look at some mixed portfolios, some combinations of resource types that are a little more realistic characterization of how Rhode Island might reach the 100% goal. We'll take a brief opportunity for questions and then a break, and come back with the Rhode Island team to talk through some policy recommendations, some recommendations for planning and enabling this transformation, and also some equity recommendations, and we'll finish with a final Q&A and some closing remarks. So if we can jump ahead. The first and second public workshops were held in July and September. The slides, as a reminder, are available on the OER website. The address is here. They're very easy to find, and I encourage you to have a look. And let's jump ahead and show you where we've been. So what we saw last time is, we started out by looking at the what is the gap between where Rhode Island is in terms of renewable generation and where it needs to be by 2030 in order to hit 100%. The gap, as we calculate now, is slightly higher because we are now accounting for the end of some existing contracts that need to be replaced, but it's very similar to what we saw before. And on the right-hand side, you see a rough estimate of the capacity of various different renewable energy types that would be needed to provide the requisite amount of energy to fill that 100%. You'll notice that clearly you need a lot more solar capacity installed to deliver the same amount of energy as, say, offshore wind. And that's just because a megawatt of solar does not produce as much energy. It has a lower capacity factor than offshore wind. So let's jump ahead. Just a real high overview. We're going to talk a lot about resource costs for various resources, focusing on both offshore and land-based wind and solar, both wholesale and retail. And we have some cost estimates of those, but those cost projections are necessarily uncertain. There are some things that could push those up and some things that could push them down. For offshore wind, we've seen some very competitive early projects that may have depressed the prices of those early contracts, which might limit future cost declines. So costs may not decline quite as much because they already were pushed down by that competitive process in the beginning. It's also entirely possible and perhaps likely that transmission upgrade costs will increase as the most attractive and inexpensive interconnection sites are utilized, and then we need to do more upgrades to the grid to integrate more offshore wind. For land-based wind, the story is similar, although in a different direction, regarding transmission availability and the cost of upgrades, particularly bringing land-based wind from northern New England. And then there are siting issues too that could push up costs. For both wholesale and retail solar, there are a number of issues that could affect cost estimates. Siting is a very important one, and the costs of interconnections, which, similar to wind, as the more attractive and less expensive sites are utilized, additional capacity beyond that may become somewhat more expensive. Of course, there are potential downward pressures on costs as well. If we see continuing technological and cost advances like we have over the last few years, they could reduce costs by more or faster for these technologies as well. And let's jump to the next slide. So last time we talked through some analyses that we had done about what the future New England grid will look like. It will look quite different from the grid of today. And it's important to take that into account when you're evaluating the various options for renewable energy. We've developed a projection. We've done some sensitivity analyses around this. This is also quite uncertain, but it gives us a basis for moving forward. The graphics here illustrate that as we move forward in time, the grid will transition. Much of that transition will happen after 2030, but it'll transition to much higher amounts of renewable generation, much reduced utilization of fossil generation, but note that the fossil generation is likely to stay around. It'll just be used less. And of course, these changes in the electric supply mix and the market will cause changes in the pricing of energy, which is important for understanding ratepayer costs. So the value of the renewable energy, the market value of that renewable energy will change as the composition of the grid changes. And we are trying to take that into account. All right, let's go one more ahead. So I mentioned briefly, we're going to talk about resource cost. We talked about these last time, and then also evaluating the above market cost. I'm not going to go review what we did before because that's been changed, and Mike will talk about that in a moment. So hold tight for just a moment to see what's changed there. It hasn't changed terribly dramatically, but in some meaningful ways. Let's jump one more slide. And what we're trying to do ultimately, of course, is to look at the costs and benefits of considerable increase in the amount of renewable energy that is serving Rhode Island, taking into account resource acquisition costs, the market revenues for energy capacity and RECs that offset those costs, the local economic impacts in terms of GDP, jobs that those resources may have on the Rhode Island economy. And of course, the greenhouse gas reductions, although that won't be a particularly distinguishing factor among the different trajectories we're looking at, because they all reach 100% by 2030, and they all offset very similar amounts of greenhouse gases. So what we ultimately are looking at will be the net cost to Rhode Island ratepayers, sort of the above market cost as we've characterized it. That's equal to the resource acquisition costs less the market revenues for energy capacity and RECs. And related but not the same are the economic impacts within Rhode Island, the local development impact and the subsequent impact on GDP and jobs in the state. There are, of course, several other factors that we need to take into account. Equity, land use and siting, whether the greenhouse gas abatement of particular strategies is actually additional. It's something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So without saying more right now, I want to turn it over to Mike Haggerty, who's going to talk us through some updates that we've done largely in response to comments and participation by stakeholders in the ratepayer cost impacts. Mike, over to you.
Great, thanks, Dean. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, so as Dean mentioned, we've updated some of our analysis of the ratepayer costs of meeting 100% renewable energy by 2030. And we're going to walk through some of those updates in the next few slides, as well as our analysis of what those ratepayer cost impacts look like. And we're using the term here, bookend portfolios, because we start here by analyzing meeting 100% of that gap that Dean just walked through by 4 different technologies, land-based wind, offshore wind, wholesale solar and retail solar. So if we can go to the next slide. The three changes that we've made based on feedback that we've received are, first, we updated our renewable resource costs, resource acquisition costs, to consider a wider range of costs based on that feedback we've gotten primarily from renewable developers. We've also reassessed the ability for these resources to receive capacity market revenues. There's a significant uncertainty, and we'll walk through how we've dealt with that. And we've also finally developed a view of the future REC market prices as a point of comparison to the Rhode Island energy programs. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll dive into the updated resource acquisition costs. So on the right here, you see for each of those four technologies that I mentioned, our projection of the resource acquisition costs that we expect if Rhode Island is going to go out and National Grid will go out procuring different resources. So for each of these, there's some uncertainty that we've accounted for here, and that was definitely one of the main pieces of feedback we received, that there's a lot of uncertainty in the future costs of these resources. There's also uncertainty about just how much it will cost to bring those resources onto the existing system. So these are our projected costs. To mention that these are all in 2020 dollars, because this is out to 2030. We're not taking into account the impact of the current production tax credit and the investment tax credit. We do continue to include the 10% investment tax credit through 2030. And you can see the range here accounts for several things. So the base costs, for example, for offshore wind, continue to be pinned in the near term to some of the recent contracts that have been signed. But the projection going forward is now accounting for a larger range based on what we've reviewed from the NREL annual technology baseline. Especially the high end is a little bit higher, accounting for limited cost declines in their conservative case. We also went to some of the best sources available about future system upgrade costs and have incorporated that. So the range that you see here includes the base cost, and at the low end, we're showing both the low end of the cost for the renewable resources themselves, as well as the low system upgrades. At the low system upgrades is assuming no incremental additional costs of those upgrades. At the high end, some additional costs. So the impact of this relative to what you saw last time is that the base cost of these resources are about $6 to $10 higher per megawatt hour in 2030. And then the high end of the range is about $25 to $40 higher. So if we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, we also went back and reviewed the ability for these resources to receive capacity market revenues. These resources can participate in both the energy and capacity market. And both of these, if they receive revenues, that will reduce the above market costs to Rhode Island ratepayers. Now, in the New England capacity market, renewable capacity that's supported by state programs recently has been able to enter the ISO New England forward capacity market, the regional capacity market, through these recently introduced substitution auctions. These are a fairly new mechanism for providing revenues to renewable resources. And so far, only 54 megawatts of renewable capacity have cleared in that market, which is why initially we assumed a relatively low zero capacity market revenue. But taking a look back at that, we saw that that's likely due to limited participation so far, as well as the low prices in the market. So in our updated analysis, we're including a certain amount of revenues that you can see on the right here of about $3.50 per megawatt hour. That's assuming a capacity market price that's equal to the average price over the last 5 years of about $4.50 per kilowatt month, as well as the amount of qualified capacity that these renewables can sell into the market based on some recent ISO New England analysis. In addition, due to this uncertainty in the market about whether they'll be able to clear the market and receive these revenues, we're discounting those revenues by 50%, just to account for that uncertainty. We're also analyzing a range where that range is from zero, in which case they would not be clearing the market, to as high as $14, accounting for a full, being able to get the full revenues from the capacity market at a higher future price that reflects kind of the long-term average price that the market expects. Next slide shows that we've also looked at the REC prices in the market. Renewable energy credits are a regional product that are bought and sold in order to meet the renewable portfolio standards in a lot of states and the renewable electricity standard in Rhode Island. The figure on the right here shows that these prices have swung pretty dramatically over the last 5 years, from almost $50 to below $10. And this is reflecting some of the short-term balances in the market. As the amount of renewable generation procurements increases, prices tend to drop. As the demand for RECs increases, they rise. We're assuming in our analysis a base cost of $30, which is reflecting about the historical average, as well as what we've found to be the price that's necessary over the long term to attract utility scale resources. But knowing that these REC prices fluctuate due to a lot of these short-term considerations, we're analyzing a range of $15 at the low end to $45 at the high end. So based on those updates, we can now show you what our projected costs of 100% of achieving 100% renewables by 2030 looks like for Rhode Island. As I mentioned, we're starting by analyzing these 4 bookend scenarios from left to right: 100% land-based wind and offshore wind, wholesale solar, and then retail solar. On the left, we're comparing this to the option that Rhode Island would have of procuring market RECs. These would be buying RECs that are available in the market based on the range of prices that I just showed you. As this shows, that appears to be the lowest cost approach to meeting 100%. We just want to point out that there's maybe some less desirable outcomes of choosing that path in terms of a lower GHG impact due to less additional renewables added to the system, limited support for local renewables, as well as increased ratepayer exposure to volatile REC prices. So on average, our base projection for that case would be about $1.4 billion over the next 20 years of cost, above market cost, to meet this 100%. And I should note that that is net of the energy and capacity revenues that we've projected. Across the different portfolios, we see that the base costs are relatively similar for the first 3 portfolios, around $2 billion over the 20 years. But they're higher for the local smaller scale retail solar of about $4.5 billion. And I should note that the range that you see here for each of these portfolios reflects that uncertainty that I just walked through in terms of the resource acquisition costs. So there are some other uncertainties about that could drive these costs a little bit higher or lower, and we show that on the next slide. So this compares the impact of 4 different uncertainties. The first is the resource cost, which is the same range that I just showed. And these are the results specifically for the 100% offshore wind bookend case. There's also uncertainty about the level of energy market and capacity market revenues. For the energy market revenues, we've tested whether the impact of higher and lower energy market revenues. Higher energy market revenues would tend to decrease ratepayer costs. So in the case of gas prices in 2030 being about $2 higher than our current projection, that would increase energy market revenues for offshore wind by about $12 per megawatt hour. And on average, across this 20-year, reduce costs by $320 million. On the high ends, if energy market prices were lower, that would increase costs to ratepayers. Similar for the capacity market revenues. This is a bit more skewed towards the low end due to the potential to receive 100% of the capacity market value at a higher future price. If that's the case, that would drop the ratepayer costs by about $400 million over this time. If there's no revenues that are able to be received, that would increase cost to ratepayer is about $140 million. We've also looked at the impact of load uncertainty, and we've seen that that's a relatively small impact due to uncertainty due to the limited difference between the high and the low load cases that we've analyzed. So next, we want to convert that into something that might be a little more tangible to you. This is obviously 20 years of costs. Can seem like a very big number, but we want to bring it down to kind of an average rate impact. So this is showing the rate impacts in 2030. On the left, we're showing as a point of comparison, this is showing the basic residential rate in 2020, which on average is about 23.2 cents per kilowatt hour. And you can see the breakdown of the different components there. For a typical residential customer, that's an average bill of about $116. The same costs that we just showed across these different portfolios have now been levelized down to a cent per kilowatt hour additional bill impact. And we are showing this as a comparison to 2020. That doesn't mean that we expect rates to continue at the same level through 2030, but we just want to give you a sense of the scale. So across these different resources, these different portfolios, you can see that rate impacts for just the market purchases, REC market purchases would be about 1 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Across the wholesale, the utility scale resources and portfolios 1 through 3, it's about 1 to 4 cents per kilowatt hours for the winds, and about 1.5 to 5 for wholesale solar. Because of the higher cost of the retail solar, that would be a higher incremental cost of about 4 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And that translates for a typical residential customer to about $10, $10 to $15, just for the kind of central base cost projection for either REC market purchases or the utility scale resources, and higher about $30 if it was 100% retail solar. And just to point out, the range that we show here is just showing the impact of that most significant uncertainty being the resource acquisition costs. One other thing we want to point out, which is important consideration on the next slide for the retail solar case, is that a lot of the retail solar is coming in through net metering. And an important cost implication of net metering is that net metering tends to shift costs from the net metered customers to non-net metered customers. Just to give you a sense of the scale of that, we wanted to look at what those costs look like and then what will look like in the next few years as a consideration of the approach to meeting the 100% renewable goal. So in the next few years, we're seeing that Rhode Island is projected to have about 400 megawatts of net meter generation. This translates to about 500 gigawatt hours of generation. Most of these facilities are what are referred to as virtual net metered facilities, which tend to be larger facilities up to 10 megawatts apiece, which is much order of magnitude or 3 orders of magnitude larger than the type of solar facility you would put on the top of a residential rooftop. Virtual net metering, however, is limited to about 6% of Rhode Island load. Because net meter customers reduce their demand as well as their utility bill payments, they shift some costs to non-net metered customers. We estimated that this level that's expected in the 4 years shifts about $55 million per year to non-net metered customers, which will further increase those rates by about 0.8 cents per kilowatt hour. This is a different approach for bringing on retail solar than the regrowth program. And this on the right here, we go through some of those differences just to highlight a few. The regrowth programs procured through National Grid. And the National Grid purchases energy, RECs, and capacity, which are then spread across all ratepayers evenly. In addition, the REC ownership in that program is transferred directly to National Grid, whereas net meter programs, the RECs are retained either by the developer or the customer. And I think that brings my section to an end. I don't know if, Dean, you have anything that you want to add to my points before you move on to the economic development. impacts.
I think you did a really nice job, Mike. Thank you. So we're going to shift from here. So we've done the analysis, and Mike has shown you sort of the results of the updated analysis of the ratepayer impacts. And we're going to shift from here into the economic impact, which is, in part uses the ratepayer impacts as an input, but also looks at sort of other factors. Initially, I'm going to go through this talking about the same bookend portfolios that Mike just discussed. So filling the entire gap with 100% of one of the four types of generation that we consider. And then we'll get into doing the same thing for sort of a blend, various different mixes of resources. So if we can jump ahead. So we use IMPLAN, which is an economic impact modeling platform, to estimate the GDP and the jobs impacts of alternative portfolios that would get Rhode Island to 100%. Importantly here, what we're doing is comparing meeting 100% or comparing meeting 100% with a particular portfolio of resources versus meeting the same 100% goal strictly with market rec purchases at an assumed rec price. And our nominal assumption for rec prices is $30, although we look at higher or lower costs. So this is not the overall impact of reaching 100%, but rather we're looking at the impact of how you reach 100%, given that Rhode Island has made a commitment to achieve that goal. So it's looking at differences in how you might meet it relative to purchasing market recs, not the total impact of reaching 100%. So the impacts on GDP and jobs occur through three different channels, and you'll see this graphically in just a moment. But they are construction expenditures for projects that are in-state. Those occur obviously before the project is online. That creates economic activity within the state, which has benefits for GDP and jobs. O&M expenditures, operating and maintenance expenditures for the project after it's online, the maintenance that needs to be done. Again, this is primarily for in-state projects. And then the tariff impacts, which is the ratepayer impacts, the above market costs that Mike just went through relative to rec purchases. So really we're comparing buying sort of a contract for energy and recs with through this portfolio of particular renewable resources versus buying energy and recs from the market at this assumed rec price. So if the portfolio that we're analyzing is cheaper than the market energy plus market recs, then the impact on GDP and jobs is positive, has a benefit. You're getting something cheaper, and that saves customers money, and saving them money gives a boost to the economy. Alternatively, if this portfolio is more expensive than buying energy and recs from the market, the economic impacts will be negative. It's important to note that the economic impacts we're calculating here does not capture all of the factors that might affect Rhode Island. So in particular, it does not include the potential positive economic benefits of seeding a new sort of export industry like offshore wind in Rhode Island. By acquiring offshore wind, Rhode Island may be able to push the development of that industry within the state, after which other states may acquire offshore wind that are procured in Rhode Island waters or installed from a Rhode Island port that would have positive impacts for Rhode Island beyond the impacts of the initial project that it developed for itself. So let's roll to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit more and then show you some pictures. So each type of renewable generation has a particular initial construction cost and a particular expenditure profile over time for, maybe 1 to 3 years before it comes online. Different technologies expend those costs into different Rhode Island economic sectors for the in-state projects. So you might have some spending in construction labor, some for cement, some for structures, wind turbines and blades, solar panels, and inverters. So those are all the components of costs for the various technologies, and they get spent into different mixes of Rhode Island economic sectors. And those expenditures in those sectors affect Rhode Island GDP and jobs through the natural interactions in the economy. O&M expenditures work the same way. They're different amounts and into different sectors in the operating phase of the project. And so the economic impact depends on which technology you employ, what's its cost, and which sectors it affects. And importantly, on whether projects are in-state or out-of-state, because an out-of-state project may have little or no direct impact on the Rhode Island economy through construction and O&M expenditures. So the technologies differ on this. Of course, retail solar is entirely in-state by definition. Land-based wind is almost entirely out-of-state because Rhode Island is not a place that has good land-based wind resources, and any significant amount of land-based wind would have to come in perhaps from New York or from northern New England. Both offshore wind and wholesale solar projects could be in-state. And for offshore wind, in-state means that it's sort of installed and serviced from a port in Rhode Island. So they could be in-state or they could be out-of-state. For out-of-state projects, those construction and O&M expenditures don't contribute significantly to in-state GDP and jobs in Rhode Island. Although they may have some modest impacts within Rhode Island. So if a Massachusetts solar facility uses components acquired from a Rhode Island supplier, it may have a positive benefit there. Or if it employs Rhode Island workers who commute to construct the site in Massachusetts, there may be some impact. And it's important to understand that this model looks at sort of representative or typical sector allocations. So any particular project, its impact on the local Rhode Island economy will depend on how that project is executed. And so if a project uses a different mix of local versus out-of-state suppliers, Rhode Island labor versus out-of-state labor, then it'll have a different effect on the Rhode Island economy. IMPLAN has within it representative or typical allocations to these sectors, but keep in mind that any particular project probably won't be exactly that allocation across sectors, just because of the natural variability in how projects are actually put together and executed. All right, let's jump ahead one more slide. I'm going to be stuck here. Here we go. So as an example, so that you can understand how the pieces of this work, we'll look at the Rhode Island GDP impact first of a 600 megawatt offshore wind project nominally online in 2027 that is in-state. So it's developed from a port in Rhode Island. This could be a project like the one that Rhode Island just announced that it will have a solicitation for. That is an up to 600 megawatt solicitation that Rhode Island is planning. Here, we're imagining that the full 600 megawatts would be built. Again, the economic impact includes those three categories: the construction, the O&M, and the tariff impact that we talked about before. And in the graph on the right, you can see each of those illustrated as vertical bars, either going up or down from the zero line. So in the few years before the project comes online, you see tall blue bars that show the positive economic impact of the construction during the construction phase, where the project is hiring a lot of Rhode Island workers and spending a lot of money in Rhode Island in order to get the project built. And that gives you a boost to GDP. It's hard to see, but if you look further out to the right, there are very short green bars that are going up that represent the economic impact of the ongoing O&M for a project once it's in operation. And the tariff impact that's illustrated here is shown as gray bars. Here, those are mostly going down. And that is because we're comparing the cost of this this hypothetical offshore wind contract at the estimated costs that we have that you saw earlier that Mike showed you, compared to purchasing $30 RECs plus market energy. As I mentioned before, that could be a positive impact if the project is cheaper than the assumed market REC and energy purchases. Here, the project happens to be a little more expensive than our assumption about those REC prices, particularly the REC prices, also the energy prices. So we think the $30 REC is a reasonable going-in projection of REC prices. The result is somewhat sensitive, and you'll see in a moment how sensitive it is to that assumption about REC prices. But keep in mind that in the last 5 years, REC prices have gone from about $45 down to about $6, and then back to $45. So projecting REC prices is very challenging, mostly because RECs themselves are a short-term instrument that reflects the short-term balance of supply and demand of RECs relative to REC requirements, the RPS requirements across New England, and the cost of a project reflects the long-term economics. So REC prices can be very volatile, and we've seen that. Keep that in mind when you're looking at the comparisons that we're doing here that compare the cost of a project against an assumed cost of RECs. So here, what we've illustrated is an in-state project. If this project was built out of state, say maybe off the coast of Maine, it would likely not yield the same construction and O&M benefits for the Rhode Island economy. The tariff impact would be the same if the project cost the same, if the contract for the offshore wind facility was the same as the one that the hypothetical one that we're looking at within Rhode Island. Just one note, it looks here like the above market costs appear to increase, or the above market costs increase, and therefore the GDP impact is more negative over time. That is a function of our assumption of sort of a level REC price and market energy prices that fall over time. Those of you who were here for the last workshop might remember that our long-term projections for the New England energy market are that energy prices will fall as renewable penetration increases and depresses the market price at the times when the renewables generate. So if you look a little more closely at the graph on the right, we show sort of by the three components. In blue, we show the construction impacts. So they're about $2.2 billion in total construction expenditures estimated to complete this project. About a little less than a third of that are expenditures that occur in state. So for instance, the cost of the turbines and the blades goes to a manufacturer that might be in Europe and doesn't land in the Rhode Island economy. But the in-state share, about $680 million of that initial cost, boosts Rhode Island GDP by about $440 million, and that's a net present value back to today of those costs at the time they occur. So those in-state expenditures boost Rhode Island GDP by a significant amount. Similarly, for the O&M expenditures, those are much lower in magnitude, but of course they occur over a longer time frame. About $750 million of O&M expenditures over the life of the project would boost Rhode Island GDP by another 160 million. And illustrated here, where the above market cost of the project is a little higher than the cost of buying the assumed $30 RECs, that would decrease Rhode Island GDP by about 260 million. Take the net of those three effects, and you see a positive impact for Rhode Island GDP of about $340 million. That NPV metric for the net GDP impact, taking into account all of those different ways in which it can occur, that's sort of a summary measure that we'll use going forward to be able to compare the different kinds of projects that you might use to meet 100%. Recognize that that NPV rolls together typically some positive impacts in the beginning, especially during the construction phase, with some negatives, some impacts that could be negative or positive in the longer term. They're not spread smoothly through time. Let's step forward one more slide. So on the slide we just talked about, we're talking about the GDP impact. You see a picture on the right here that looks very similar in character, and it's not an accident that it does, but this is the jobs impact of the same project within Rhode Island. And so you're not surprised to see a positive impact on jobs in the state during the construction phase. It takes a lot of people to put in place a 600 megawatt offshore wind project. And also some jobs for the O&M phase, again, over a much longer period, but smaller magnitude. And because of for the same reason that we saw a negative impact on GDP due to the assumed project, or the project being slightly more costly than the assumed REC price, you'd also see a negative impact on jobs, because that higher cost for consumers and businesses has a slightly depressing effect on the economy. So, and again, that can go in either direction based on the assumptions we've used for this base case. It's a slight negative over the long term. It's important to remember that the GDP effect is not something that's totally separate from the jobs effect, that you could add them together. You can't add those two together, because the jobs effect is really a significant component of the GDP effect. But it does give another way to look at the overall economic impact. And here we see over the 25 or so year life of the project, from the start of construction until the end of life, the aggregate impact would be around 2,500 jobs per year. So averaged over this whole time frame, it's a positive, but it's not smooth over time. It's positive in the beginning and somewhat slightly negative on net in the end. All right, now that we've looked at that for a single project, let's step forward one more and look at one of the first of the Bookend portfolios, or one of the Bookend portfolios. This is an all-offshore wind portfolio. So this is not just a 600 megawatt offshore wind project, but this is assumed to be a series of offshore wind projects that together fill the entire gap to 100%. We've illustrated it here as a series of equal-sized projects coming online each year, starting in 2025 and finishing in 2030. And of course, they have overlapping construction periods. Of course, since offshore wind projects are by their nature very large, an actual profile would be much more lumpy than this. we've used this pattern of sort of a series of equal annual additions of capacity over time as an illustrative pattern, and we assume the same pattern, equal annual additions over time for the other bookend portfolios, and it just allows us to do an easier comparison. So you'll see here the construction period starts in 2022 for the first project, but doesn't end until 2029 when just before the last one comes online. The O&M and the tariff impacts start when the very first project comes online, and then they grow as more and more pieces of this portfolio come online. And as before, even though it's a little bit spread out, the net impact is initially positive and it's dominated by that construction effect. And in the longer term, the tariff impact could be positive or negative when compared to purchasing RECs. So this is and you see the solid green line on here traces the net of all of those three different components. Which is significantly positive in the beginning and then assumed to be a little bit negative here in the outer years. If this were an out-of-state project, if there were no in-state benefits from construction and O&M, it's a little hard to see, but you can see there's a dashed green line that follows the bottom of the gray bars. So you'd have a significantly lower and in fact negative GDP impact for an out-of-state project because you sacrifice those in-state economic benefits if you go with an out-of-state project. So let's jump ahead one more. I'm going to do a time check. I think maybe we're on track. And we've done exactly the same thing for each of the four bookend portfolios for both land-based and offshore wind, as well as wholesale and retail solar. And the profiles are qualitatively similar for most of these, where construction for an in-state project creates some early GDP benefits. And similarly for O&M, if it's in-state, there are some GDP benefits in operation. We're looking here at GDP. The charts look very similar for the employment impact. They're not exactly the same. And for all of these, we are comparing them to the same assumed $30 REC price and same market energy price. And for the same reason that we saw a slightly negative impact from offshore wind, as you'll remember, the above market costs for land-based wind and wholesale solar are quite similar to those for offshore wind. And so you see very similar tariff impact effects here. But again, at a higher REC price, those impacts could turn around. They could be positive. One thing to note that really jumps out at you here, we saw previously that the above market cost for retail solar is considerably higher than for the other three utility scale technologies. That is true here, but there's an additional wrinkle is that for in-state retail solar projects, there is a much larger negative tariff impact that's driven by that higher above market cost, but it's largely offset over the entire time frame by the positive impact of the construction effect. So you can see in our summary measure for the offshore wind bookend portfolios, you can see in the top right that we looked at a moment ago, $540 million of NPV of the GDP impact. For retail solar in the bottom right, the NPV of that impact is $320 million. So even though the costs are much higher, the GDP impact is not that much lower because of the positive impact of that construction. That's also helped a little bit by the fact that retail solar has more local benefits for each dollar spent because it requires more in-state activity. Imagine more people climbing on roofs to install retail solar. It's generally done in a somewhat or often done at a somewhat smaller scale than wholesale solar. So while it costs more, it does contribute more to the local economic impacts. One thing to stress here in all of these, we are showing the impacts only for resources that are online by 2030. Only the resources that you need to get to 100% by 2030. As we discussed in the last workshop, or maybe the last two workshops, it's very likely that Rhode Island will continue to need to add more renewable resources to stay at 100% beyond 2030, because load is likely to grow, driven by electrification of the transportation and building sectors. We're not showing the impact of that here, but it is likely to, it would be likely to exist. So for instance, if you continued to build new renewable projects to meet growing load after 2030, then the construction period or the construction of those projects would continue on out further into the future, and you'd have sort of a a longer blend of both these the benefits and the resource costs over time. Okay, let's go to the next slide where I said we're going to use that NPV of GDP impact as a metric to compare across different technologies. It's a little hard to compare based on these graphics. So the point of this slide is really to tell you how to read the slide I'm going to show you next. So let me walk you through this. This is looking here at that offshore wind bookend portfolio, and we want to consider a couple of different kinds of uncertainty that might affect the economic impacts of that portfolio. So in the bottom left graph, you'll see in the very center of that bar, this graph shows our base resource cost, which is what we saw in the previous slide, or a couple of slides, for offshore wind. And the center dot on that bar that's labeled $30 rec price is the case that we just saw previously. You saw the NPV of the GDP effect of that portfolio was $540 million, and that's represented here at that dot in the middle. If we said instead, well, Rex, your reference point might change. If the project costs the same, but your reference point changes, the purchasing market Rex changes, how does that affect the GDP impact? So if market Rex are higher, then the cost of the project itself is cheaper than buying market Rex. And the fact that it is cheaper saves customers money relative to that other alternative of buying Rex. And that savings gives you a boost in GDP relative to what GDP would be in the reference strategy of buying Rex from the market at $45. So you see that as the top dot on this bar in the lower left here. So if the reference rec price was $45, you'd have just a little over $1 billion in GDP impact. Sort of an improvement in the Rhode Island economy relative to purchasing Rex of about $1 billion from going with this offshore wind contract. Alternatively, if it turned out that Rex were only $15, you'd say, oh gosh, I've spent more for this project. I get the local economic benefits, but I'm paying more in costs relative to purchasing cheap Rex. And so that really diminishes the GDP impact down to almost zero if you assume $15 Rex, again, with reference to our base resource costs for offshore wind. Over on the right, we take that bar from the left, becomes the middle bar on the right, and then we look at alternative cases on the resource cost, uncertainty on the resource cost. So if we said that offshore wind project might come in less costly than our base resource cost, it might be at our low resource cost. You see that as the left of the three bars in the bottom right. So if this project costs less, then that's a benefit to the economy. There's sort of two partially offsetting factors. If it costs less, there's a lower ratepayer impact. So in fact, it might be cheaper than buying the RECs. But you also get less in-state economic benefit. If it's cheaper, if the project is cheaper because developers have figured out a more efficient way to install offshore wind, maybe it uses less labor, but that means there's less positive impact for Rhode Island labor. Again, the vertical range of that bar reflects the range of different REC prices. So the top of the bar corresponds to a $45 REC price, the bottom to a $15 REC price used as the reference. And then over on the right, the rightmost of those three bars looks at a case with the high resource cost for offshore wind, again varying across the REC price range of $15 to $45. So this, I showed you first the $540 million in NPV benefit, and it's hard enough to understand that. But then when you layer on a couple of levels of uncertainty, this graphic in the lower right gives you an idea of the potential range in the economic impact. So going all the way from almost a positive $1.5 billion all the way to negative $500 million in the case where the resource was costly, but RECs were cheap. So you're paying a much higher above market cost. Now you can ask yourself, is it likely, if the resource was costly, is it likely that RECs would be that cheap? And the answer might be that the extremes of these bars might be a little less likely, just because the cost of renewable technologies has an impact on the REC price. Of course, REC prices can vary a lot in the short term, but certainly in the long term, you'd expect the cost of the resources to have an impact on the REC price. So I hope you're able to understand the sort of how to read this picture. I can't see your nodding heads, unfortunately, but I'll assume that they are. And step forward to the next slide, where we put this into operation for all of these 4 bookend portfolios. So what you just saw on the last slide was the 100% offshore wind bookend portfolio. That's the second group of 3 bars here. So that's exactly what you saw on the last slide, characterizing that uncertainty. And we're showing here the other 3 alongside, land-based wind on the left and wholesale and retail solar on the right. Just to review, each of the 3 bars, each bar represents a resource cost case, low, base, or high, and the range of the bar itself reflects REC costs, $45 at the top, $15 at the bottom of that range. The thing that you notice, and have to say here, for offshore wind, wholesale solar, we've assumed for this analysis that these consist of in-state projects. Out-of-state projects would look different in a way that we'll understand in just a moment. So what you see is here the higher above market costs, that's the tariff impact component, is partly offset by the positive effect of the higher in-state construction expenditures. And this is true both within resources and across resources. You can see this best by comparing land-based wind with offshore wind. With land-based wind, since it's assumed to be out of state, you have only the tariff impact effect. You don't have construction benefits. You don't have O&M benefits from an out-of-state project. So that as the resource cost is higher, that pushes the GDP impact down and potentially quite negative, because you don't have that offsetting in-state investment. And so the difference between those 3 bars is much greater for land-based wind because all you're seeing is that tariff impact. It's much mitigated in the other three cases because a higher tariff impact is mitigated by the in-state construction and operating benefits of those projects that are located in-state. The other thing to notice here is that the very right set of bars for retail solar, you'll remember the above market cost of retail solar is considerably higher than it is for the other technologies, the other three technologies. And yet we see here that the economic impact is very similar, really almost exactly the same range. And that's because of those GDP benefits of that technology. Even though it is more expensive, those dollars get spent in Rhode Island, and a larger share of those dollars get spent in Rhode Island with retail solar as compared to wholesale solar and offshore wind. And that really improves the overall GDP impact. So you've got this offsetting factor that helps to offset the higher cost of the retail solar technology. So I think we can, so I'm gonna take a pause here because the next thing we're gonna do is say, let's create some additional portfolios that are blends of these three things and evaluate those. So let's step forward and one more slide. So if I haven't exhausted you yet, stick with me. We've got 4 bookend portfolios. Imagine those are numbered 1 through 4. We've created 6 more portfolios here that consist of representative combinations of those 4 technologies, numbered 5 through 10, and they're described in the table on the right. These are based in part on the recent Rhode Island RFP for up to 600 megawatts of offshore wind. So we've assumed in these portfolios either 600 megawatts of offshore wind or 400 megawatts of offshore wind, potentially only 200 megawatts of offshore wind, and in the last of these portfolios, no offshore wind, but a little bit of land-based wind. And so if you look at the little pie at the start of each of the rows in the table on the right, that illustrates the quantity of each of the different technologies, with the blue being offshore wind, the yellow being wholesale solar, the orange wedge is retail solar, and the only time land-based wind shows up in these is in the very last one, the small wedge of green. And the reason we don't have more offshore wind or more scenarios that include, the reason we don't have more land-based wind or more scenarios that include land-based wind is because of concerns about the availability, about how much you could actually get given the transmission limitations that it faces across the New England grid. So I don't want to go through and read all the details of all of these, but essentially you'll see that the portfolios are organized with high amounts of offshore wind in the first 2, and the first one fills the rest of the gap with all wholesale solar. Portfolio 6, the second row, does the same large amount, 600 megawatts of offshore wind, but splits the remainder between wholesale and retail solar. Scenario 7 looks at a smaller amount, only 400 megawatts of offshore wind, and 8 does the same thing with differing mixes of either primarily wholesale solar or primarily retail solar. And then portfolio 9 looks at a relatively small incremental amount of offshore wind and filling the rest of the portfolio with equal amounts of retail and wholesale solar. And in the last one, it's a mostly solar portfolio with only a small amount of offshore wind. So you can notice that we've organized these portfolios so that the amount of offshore wind is decreasing as you go down, and the amount of retail solar, the most expensive resource, is increasing as you go down. So let's jump to the next slide and see what that means in terms of the ratepayer impacts that we've talked about previously, and then we'll look at the economic impacts. So what you see here is very similar to a chart that you saw above, or the left part of this is very similar to the chart above, where we looked at the ratepayer impact on the very left of market rec purchases, and we'll use that as a reference, and our 4 bookend portfolios, 1 through 4. Those are exactly the same things that we saw that Mike presented up above. And then on the right, you see with the multicolored pies above each one of these, you see the mixed portfolios. And really, you almost could have guessed what the resource cost, the ratepayer impact of these above market costs would have been. And they relate to, because it's just combinations of the bookend portfolios. Since the 3 utility scale technologies, bookends 1 through 3, are all very similar in cost, different mixes of those don't change the overall cost of the portfolio very much. What really drives the above market cost is how much retail solar is in the mix. So you see the vertical blue bars for each of these portfolios, 5 through 10. They increase. The range shows the range due to the resource cost effect, but it increases over time because you have a larger and larger mix of retail solar in the portfolios as you go to the right. And what the mix of the other technologies doesn't necessarily have a big effect on the above market cost because those technologies all cost similar amounts. So, and you see that actually the ranges are overlapping by a fair amount, even across all of these, these extremely different portfolio mixes. Let's go one more slide. I see I'm almost running out of time here. And I think this will be almost my last slide, maybe a couple of comments on this. So we've done the same thing here. This is the same picture, but now we're looking at the economic impact here, the GDP impact of these portfolios. Previous slide was the ratepayer cost impact. Here we're looking at the overall economic impact, accounting for the in-state expenditures where those happen. So the left part of this looks very familiar. It's the same picture that I showed you just a little while ago for the 4 bookend portfolios. And on the right, you'll see the net GDP impact, this net present value again, of each of these different portfolios. And the thing that is really striking is it doesn't differ very much. It's very similar across all of those portfolios. And that's because despite the fact that a bigger and bigger mix of retail solar in the portfolio causes the above market cost to go up, you've got the offsetting impact of the in-state construction, the higher dollars of in-state construction that helps the GDP and partly offsets that. Here, the range of the bars, just like on the left, the range of the bars shows the impact of the rec price range. So from $15 to $45 rec as your reference point. So I think this is a really interesting perspective to say that in terms of GDP, those different portfolios, those different mixes of technologies don't make a big difference in terms of the GDP impact. The story is different, and maybe we can just jump to the next slide. So these 2 metrics, the above market cost that ratepayers face and the overall GDP impact within Rhode Island, they tell somewhat different stories. So, and in particular, the portfolio with the lowest above market cost is not necessarily the one with the best economic impacts in the state. And it's back to this retail solar having much higher above market costs compared to the other three alternatives. And therefore, higher cost when you have more retail solar in your portfolio. But that offsetting positive economic impact of the in-state construction helps to offset in terms of GDP. So it's important to consider both of those, both the GDP effect and the above market cost that ratepayers are going to have to pay. So in the end, retail solar has a really similar net economic impact, which is encouraging due to the factors that we already talked about. There's sort of more local impact per dollar expended. The positives and the negatives are both much bigger with retail solar, but they're roughly balanced. A really important note, though, is those positive and negative economic impacts, the GDP and job impacts, they don't necessarily accrue to the same populations. So within Rhode Island, building out using a lot of retail solar to build out the portfolio of renewables will benefit the workers installing those retail solar installations. But it's not as good for a ratepayer who has to pay the cost of that, but doesn't get the direct benefit of those jobs. So there's a trade-off to be had here. Land-based wind, to the extent that it's even feasible to get it to Rhode Island, or to get much more of it without significant transmission upgrades, it lacks those local benefits. So even though its cost is about the same as sort of locally sourced offshore wind or utility solar, its economic impact is substantially less attractive. It's possible if there was a big out-of-state cost advantage for some technology, it's possible that it'd be worth foregoing those in-state economic benefits in order to get a lower priced resource from out of state. But we haven't seen evidence to suggest that you should expect out-of-state resources to be materially less costly than in-state resources within a given resource type. That could happen certainly for specific projects, but on average, we don't see a reason to expect that. So I think I've used up most of my time, but we have some poll questions now that we want to now that we've given you sort of our view of these different technologies. Ellen, maybe we can jump ahead to the next slide. And I think Carrie is going to lead this poll question.
Sure, thanks very much. So we do have some poll questions here. For those of you who have already logged into the polling software, this will be easy. For those of you who have not already logged in, you can take a look at the instructions at the top of the screen. So there's either a website that you can go to, or you can text e-resources 411 to 22333, and then just indicate your answer by text. So these polling questions particularly help us understand the general sentiment of the participants in these workshops, and it helps us understand what your preferences are. This first poll question is asking which portfolio is most appealing to you. So you can choose your response. The portfolios here are the same as the ones that Dean has just outlined on the previous slides, including buying RECs, the bookend portfolios, and then the mixed portfolios. So we'll give everyone 30 seconds to indicate their answers. We'll be able to see this update in real time as more and more people respond.
We seem to have pretty broadly distributed preferences.
It looks like responses are slowing down, but we'll just give it 10 more seconds. Excellent. All right. Thank you for everyone who has responded so far. Again, like I said, this is just helpful for us to understand reactions and preferences from participants. And we appreciate everyone responding to the poll. I think we should move to the next question at this point. So in this question, we're asking you, this is an open-ended question, we're asking why your preferred portfolio that you just indicated on the previous poll is the most appealing portfolio for you. Again, we'll give everyone 30 seconds to enter in their responses.
Not a lot of detail.
Great, it looks like we are getting some responses in. We will, in lieu of showing these on the screen, just because there will be a lot of words to read, we will take these back and take a look at them. And we appreciate you telling us your perspectives here. I think at the risk of cutting people short, we should move on for time. So polling question number 3 really gets at the idea of trade-offs between retail solar development and wholesale procurement. And so this question asks, retail solar development costs more than wholesale procurement, but delivers additional economic development benefits. Which portfolio would you lean toward preferring? And it looks like we're seeing a mix of preferences. That's what makes these so interesting. Looks like responses have started to slow. So let's give it just a couple more seconds. Okay. Thank you to everyone who has responded to that question. I think we will move on to our 4th polling question. Again, this one gets at the trade-offs between retail solar and wholesale procurement. So retail solar development costs more than wholesale procurement, but delivers additional economic development benefits. How much more per kilowatt hour would you be willing to pay for retail solar development relative to wholesale development? And similar to before, it looks like we are seeing a range of responses. It's perfectly fine to choose not sure at the bottom. Great, and we are seeing responses slow down, so I'll give it another 5 or 10 seconds. All right. Well, thank you again to everyone who has responded to these poll questions. This gives us some information about what everyone in the audience is thinking, and we do appreciate you participating in this way. I think we can move on to the next slide. And at this point, what we'll do is we'll have a short question and answer session based on the questions that we've been receiving in the Q&A feature. I know that we're a little behind time, so I think we'll just queue up 3 questions here for the Brattle team to respond to. The first question is, how do you anticipate the new presidential administration will affect renewables development? Do you expect increased federal incentives that will add to development pressure and/or timelines for development? I'll turn it over to the Brattle team to respond first.
Harry, I thought you had indicated you wanted to answer that one.
Jürgen, you should have a try at this one. I don't.
Well, I'm going to get the next 2, so I'm happy to sort of take a start. I mean, at a very high level, I think one of the slides indicated that pretty clearly. These sort of cost assumptions sort of bake in what's currently on the book for kind of federal, especially tax-related incentives. And so I would think one of the most important potential changes here is that a new administration might sort of change what's currently in the book in terms of investment tax credits or production tax credits. And to the extent they, even if they're symmetric across the various technologies, i.e. if both solar and wind got the same ITC, the fact that the capital costs are different for these technologies might affect sort of the relative attractiveness of portfolio. So that's, I think, the most important ones. You can always dream that there will be sort of stronger incentives that sort of, set targets nationally for these kinds of technologies. But I would say that the chances of that happening are pretty slim. I don't know whether anybody else wants to jump in on answering that.
Might depend on events in Georgia.
Yeah. Well, all of us are Waxman Markey survivors, so I'm not. Most of us are, at least. I'm not sure. The Senate had like 60 Democrats then, and they couldn't get that bill passed. So I'm not quite sure whether 50 plus the vice president.
Yeah, this is Nick. I would say, look, based upon what we have seen in the campaign and what's been said by the candidates, and now the president-elect. I think we suspect that there'll be a more favorable outlook in terms of supporting renewable energy and energy efficiency and other clean energy measures from the federal government over the coming 4 years. But we're short on specifics. Of course, the new administration will have to take place and clarify their priorities. But I think the general sense, at least from where I sit, is that we're likely to see more leadership from the front by the federal government in the next few years, and that is aligned with our own state's interests. So I think that's a positive thing.
I'm gonna sort of add a little bit to what Nick just said in another dimension, other than just sort of the costs to Rhode Island, if you want, which the federal tax credits would affect. I mean, a more proposed administration might also address some of the non-cost factors that, I'm anticipating answering another question that's coming in some ways in part. So as many of you know, so the development of offshore wind has actually been significantly delayed, for example, due to perhaps reasonable, but perhaps some not so reasonable reasons that have to do with the federal government. And so, we talked about cost and economic benefits. There are other dimensions to what you would procure, what mix you would procure. Some of it has to do with citing risks, with other development risks, and I would count the fact that you need various approvals from the federal government as one of those risks. So an administration that is more favorable disposed towards renewable energy development more generally might lower some of those risks, and the ones that I mentioned, sort of, getting offshore wind stuff, which is in federal waters, approved through the approval process, perhaps getting more transmission built, broadly speaking, which would also probably favor the larger resources. Those are 2 examples where federal policy might be impacted by a new administration, ways that affect the ultimate mix of resources that Rhode Island would procure.
Great, thanks for those responses. The next question we have up is, when you consider job opportunities, do you separate this into blue collar and white collar jobs? And do you consider that people filling those jobs might come from out of state? Again, I'll turn it to the Brattle team first to respond.
Yeah, I mean, Dean, if you want to talk about this, great. I'm also happy to do it.
I'll give an initial comment and then you can fill in. The analysis that we do, the IMPLAN analysis, does look sector by sector and job category by job category. So buried in that analysis is that distinction between blue collar and white collar jobs, and yes, both are included in the jobs values that we've presented, and we just present the total summary. We don't distinguish those, although one could go back and do that. As I mentioned, I think I'm seeing the question in the chat about using white collar workers from Rhode Island versus from the state or country where the developer is located. Project by project, how that project is developed and executed will differ, and different projects may have different approaches to this. They may choose to use more local resources, more local white collar labor, or to use labor that is imported, which could be across an electronic connection. People don't actually need to be in Rhode Island to do a lot of the white collar work that has to happen to make these projects occur. And so it is an important consideration, and our analysis has a nominal allocation of where those jobs come from. IMPLAN has within it, in the offshore wind sector of the economy that's built into IMPLAN, it has an allocation of where are those jobs? Are they inside Rhode Island? Are they outside Rhode Island? And but that doesn't mean that any particular project is going to follow that exact mapping. And that may be an issue that Rhode Island wants to consider when it's evaluating alternative bids that it may be getting for up to 600 megawatts of offshore wind in the fairly near future. It may want to look carefully at what is the developer's plan for how it will provide the labor resources for this white collar, including white collar as well as blue collar.
Yeah, I'm going to add, this is exactly right what Dean said. I mean, it's important to understand that the model we're using in IMPLAN is one of several of these kinds of models that try to assess the economic impact of something on some region. It's really important to recognize that all of those models are just that. And most of those models rely on data from the past, sort of analyzing what the composition of the economy in the past, to then try to estimate what happens in the future. And especially when you have relatively new industries emerging, that is not a very precise exercise. In addition, I think the only thing we can do here is sort of model, and Dean hinted at it, model sort of at the project level. It's like if you built a 600 megawatt offshore wind farm, so we talk to the offshore wind developers, there's data available, we can look at sort of the cost breakdown and including, for example, by labor category, right? But one of the things we can't do with these models is reflect, one, decisions that are made by the developers that would move away from sort of the standard decomposition of the costs, how many white collar, how many blue collar, and then more importantly, where do they live? Because, and I think, Nick, you might be able to jump in here with more detailed information, both with respect to companies overall, like, right, if there's an offshore wind industry in the region, then there's a real question of where some of the pieces of that supply chain locate. And I know early on, one of the major developers made a commitment to have its development office in the state of Rhode Island. So that's not the kind of, analysis that you can perform with these kinds of models. So there's, as Dean pointed out, there's room for negotiation. And I think that's really important. Beyond that, where people live, another thing to sort of recognize where people live versus where they work. There are some real constitutional challenges to sort of prescribing where people live, I think. There's the interstate commerce clause and things like that. But it's also important to understand that while that matters, it doesn't matter quite as much as you might think. Since, clearly somebody living in the state of Rhode Island and working in the state of Rhode Island would pay, for example, state income tax. Whereas if they live in Massachusetts and travel in, they wouldn't pay that. And so there would be a loss there. But to the extent that they spend all of their day working here, they would still go to lunch and dinner here and spend money in the state of Rhode Island, which have an impact. And vice versa. So, some of the people who live in Rhode Island and pay state income tax in Rhode Island might go shopping in Massachusetts or in Connecticut. So estimating the impact across these state boundaries, especially in a region where that's relatively small, where people travel across, is pretty hard. But it's also important not to sort of get bogged down on, if it doesn't precisely estimate it, it's going to be way wrong.
Yeah, no, this is Nick. I think Jürgen has hit it on the head. We've done our best here to leverage the tools we have available to us to make the GDP and job impact estimates that have been presented. I think the fact is that we in Rhode Island should be honest with ourselves about what the offshore wind industry represents. We are certainly first in the water, and we are and have made a significant commitment to what is a burgeoning industry up and down the East Coast. And we will continue to work with our colleagues at the Commerce Department and with the governor and the legislature and others to have Rhode Island punch above its weight in securing economic development benefits and job benefits. And I think that we have seen that, at least with the Rev Wind process, and we anticipate that will continue moving forward. But at the end of the day, Rhode Island alone, even if we wanted it to, could not supply all of the infrastructure and all of the business and all of the jobs needed for this industry to grow at the rate at which it must, I think, for the region to achieve its long-term decarbonization goals. And so there's, I think, an understanding with my colleagues in state government that this is in large part also a regional play, right? In that working closely with Massachusetts and Connecticut in particular. Look, if Rhode Island can't get any given job with offshore wind, we would welcome Mass or Connecticut to get it if that's the case, because that's likely to benefit all of southern New England. And we're competing against now not just New York, but the Mid-Atlantic states and Virginia for a lot of this investment. But a lot of investment is to come, and I'm confident that Rhode Island is very well positioned to again punch above our weight as we try to do and attract more than our fair share. But understanding that it's not all going to come to Rhode Island as much as we might wish it.
Wonderful. Being mindful of time, we have just one question left that I'm hoping the team can respond to briefly. I do want to note that if your question has not been answered live, please do put it into the Q&A and check back to see for a written response. We'll be doing our best to try to respond to all of the questions in the Q&A feature. So the last question before break is, does any of this analysis consider the impacts on required growth of the distribution systems? And as a follow-on to that, to what extent has the analysis considered the effects of additional load due to heating and transportation electrification and the effects of additional renewables that might be needed to synthesize renewable fuels? I'll turn to the Brattle team first.
Mike, I'm going to invite you to say a word about the distribution system. I know you've focused on that.
Sure, yeah, we've taken a look at the cost of bringing these retail solar facilities specifically onto the system and the need to upgrade the distribution system to continue to do so. We've seen a trend over the last few years where those costs have increased, and we've included that trend and some uncertainty about that trend into our analysis. Those costs are specifically for bringing the power from solar facilities onto the system in terms of getting the power to the existing system and then any upgrades necessary to allow that power to flow throughout the system. We haven't taken an overall system, we haven't done an overall distribution planning study here. I think that is an important outcome of our analysis, to know that that's an important next step. And I think that's something that Nick will address in the next section, that taking a longer view in distribution planning will be important in considering the impacts of more increased amount of renewable generation on the distribution system.
So if I can respond to the second part of that question, as I understand it, was about electrification and increased load from other sectors like the building sector and potentially transportation. Yes, we have accounted for electrification of those sectors in our load projection, and it does add a component of load that we assume needs to be met, that, you know, part of the load that you need to meet 100% of. By 2030, that is not a huge effect. It's a relatively modest effect by 2030. But for those of you who were here for the previous webinar, we did look out beyond 2030, and we do anticipate significant additional load from electrification of the heat sector and the transportation sector, really sort of kicking in maybe starting in the early 2030s and continuing for maybe a decade or so beyond that, in order to reach the overall economy-wide decarbonization goals that the state has, many other states have. You know, recall, we're looking here at just the electric sector. That's only one component of the overall economy. In fact, it's it's a minor share. It's not small, but it's not the majority of the total emissions from the state of Rhode Island. Those other sectors they emit much more, but their ability to electrify is potentially one of the most promising pathways to decarbonize those sectors. And so, and the ability to decarbonize the transport or the heat sectors by electrifying depends on having decarbonized electricity. So the electric sector is really key. But again, we don't expect to see very large amounts of electrification load by 2030, but we do expect a lot of it beyond then.
Great. Well, with the remaining time in mind, why don't we take a quick break, and would ask folks to be back by 12:05. It's a 10-minute break, and we'll move towards some of the policy and programmatic recommendations once we get back. So 12:05, folks. Thanks. All right, folks, welcome back. I'm gonna move into the second part of our agenda today. Let's go into advance to the next slide. So for the time we have remaining, the OER team, supplemented by welcomed observations by the Brattle Group, want to start walking through some of our draft policy and programmatic recommendations coming out of the analysis, and certainly supplemented by you know, our experience and understanding of state policy goals, which are numerous. It's more than you know, it's more than just carbon-free energy. And so so why don't we begin? We can skip this slide. A little bit about us. So we have tried to integrate 4 critical components as part of this overall effort. You may remember at the beginning of this process, when we held our first public workshop, that we created a set of foundational principles, and we have tried to carry those through to this point. And so you'll see on some of the subsequent slides that we identify how some of the recommendations tie back to those principles that we discussed with all of you and that you helped inform. We, of course, as you heard over the last couple of hours, have conducted some robust and great technical analysis. We have received public input, both during the technical workshops as well as written comments submitted by email, and we'll continue to do so over the next couple of weeks. And all of that has really helped inform these recommendations to ultimately satisfy the goals of the governor's executive order, and honoring the various policy goals that the state has set forth. Next slide. So this slide and the next, we'll just walk through a couple of key project insights, some of which have may have already been discussed. I think the most important one is that this is achievable. It's bold and it's nation leading, but we can do this in Rhode Island. We know how to do it, and we have a suite of policies and programs that can already help foster that success. Important to that is clearly defining what we mean by 100% renewable electricity. We've had some discussion over the last couple of workshops about that, and that we want to ensure that we can transparently account for success or failure, if which we'll try to avoid, and so we can talk about that in a moment as well. Our current portfolio, which we report on quarterly on our website as part of the governor's 1,000 megawatt strategy, it contains a mix of local resources and large scale procurements. And we expect that to continue. We think that there are benefits to a diverse mix of resources. They can provide a range of benefits at different levels, some of which you heard earlier, and at a range of costs, which we also must balance. And it's critical, I believe, for Rhode Island to be successful, is to be cognizant of the fact that this has to be paid for. These investments cost money. They accrue long-term benefits, and they're vital to addressing climate change, but nonetheless, they still do have to be paid for. And achievement of our clean energy future requires ratepayers to support those investments, as I mentioned, in order to drive the energy, economic, and environmental outcomes we seek. And we showed a little bit of that analysis earlier on, and the impact is real, and we acknowledge that up front. Next slide. So, as we've shown, there is significant uncertainty in the future costs of individual renewable energy resource types, but we've identified that utility scale resources, including solar, offshore wind, and land-based wind, have similar cost ranges, and that the distributed renewable resources may have significantly higher costs. But as Dean laid out earlier on one of the slides, those resources also deliver, in some cases, a higher level of benefits too that also must be considered. We also show that in-state renewable resources, including those in adjacent waters, provide material and significant local economic development benefits and job creation relative to out-of-state procurements, or I should say procurement of out-of-state resources. Regional dynamics, which we'll have a couple of slides on in a moment, particularly market design and transmission planning, also affect our ability to achieve these goals, as well as local costs, but also create some interesting opportunities. And as shown in today's discussion and some of the questions we've received during the course of today's agenda, different renewable portfolios and resource types cause different and somewhat unknown investment needs, both in the distribution and transmission systems. And those needs may require a different way of planning for this clean energy future, an integrated manner, planning system that tries to optimize outcomes both from a system as well as from a cost perspective. And ultimately, to achieve and maintain 100% renewable electricity beyond the next decade, we're going to need some innovative policy, programmatic, and technical solutions. And those solutions will need to evolve as penetration of renewable resources accelerates across the region and increasingly challenging grid impacts emerge, some of which we're already seeing. And those include both system impacts as well as the siting challenges associated with developing these resources. Next slide. This is just a recap of those guiding principles I mentioned, in which we covered in depth back in the first workshop. The next couple of slides go into greater detail about those. We won't spend any time there, but we did want to refresh everybody's minds about the decarbonization economic and policy principles we had developed. Next slide. And we can skip that slide. And skip that slide. And that one. And we'll post these slides on the website. And again, I believe this material is both in the first public workshop slides as well as, of course, these slides, which will be posted. So based upon the insights we have from the study and in our experience and understanding of both policy and industry trends, we've broken up our recommendations into 3 buckets, if you will. One we've termed policy, which I will walk through momentarily. And these are recommendations that define and achieve the procurements needed for 100% renewable electricity. There are also planning and enabling recommendations that are designed to reduce risk, improve flexibility, and ultimately, ideally, optimize the integration of these resources into the system at the lowest reasonable cost. And finally, we have a suite of principles and thoughts around equity, on how to foster more equitable outcomes in partnership with frontline communities and all of you. Next slide. So I believe we have another poll question, and the manner to respond is at the top of this page. And I'll ask Yasmin or Carrie to jump in. I'm not sure if these are the answers 1, 2, and 3 for folks to respond to. Is that correct?
Sure, happy to jump in. So what we want to do, we know we have limited time left, so we just want to make sure that we spend enough time on the policy recommendations that the participants of this webinar, are most interested in. And so this poll question is asking you to rank the 3 types of recommendations. So policy, planning and enabling, and equity. Those are the categories that Commissioner Uchi just covered. We see things shifting around. It looks like as of right now, folks are most primarily interested in the policy recommendations and then in planning and enabling and equity. So we'll just give it another 10 seconds to allow folks to respond. And then we'll move on and rest assured that we will get through all of the recommendations, and these slides will be posted online following the webinar. And so you'll be able to spend time reading through everything and you'll be able to see everything.
Yeah, and we acknowledge we don't have all the answers. I think that's important. We've done our best here, and we know that for some of you, we're not going to be able to address every question, and we won't be able to address every question in our final report. But we have tried to develop a suite of items that we think can be successful and can enable the achievement of this pretty dynamic goal. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, so I'll start with the policy recommendations, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Gill for the planning recommendations, and to Yasmin on our team to discuss the equity recommendations. So here for policy, we need to ensure that we can achieve these goals, and in particular, we believe we can do that transparently
think we lost Nick.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Oh, now we can hear you. Yep.
Yeah, I was booted by Zoom. I apologize. Or Zoom should apologize, I guess. Well, I'm glad I'm back. So we'll talk a moment about what 100% renewable energy standard should achieve and why. We also think it's absolutely critical and foundational to everything we do in our clean energy portfolio to decrease consumption and reduce long-term costs. And energy efficiency and least cost procurement strategies are a mechanism to do that. And so we'll talk about that. And finally, you know, I know we've looked at some bookend portfolios and we've had some good Q&A about different resource types. It's our opinion, and I think it's frankly just a reflection of reality, that in order for us to achieve our goals, we're going to need all these different resource types. We're going to need offshore wind, and we're going to need retail solar, and that policy will likely continue to support a range of resources, and that has benefits. It can have reliability benefits, to have a diversified portfolio. It can have cost benefits in terms of what consumers must bear, and it also impacts a range of GDP and job impacts. But while we want to maintain continued support for these programs, we do think some of them have to begin to evolve, and in short order, frankly, to deliver more affordable and sustainable outcomes from a consumer and from an environmental perspective. Next slide. All right, so I know this is one that is near and dear to many of your hearts, and I've had offline conversations with some of the folks on this call and some of our advocacy groups around this, and we do support a 100% renewable energy standard in Rhode Island, and I know that there have been there's been legislation in the past seeking to achieve this. It's a market-based mechanism for those of you who are not as familiar with it, and it can ensure that our electricity demand is offset with renewable resources over time. The use of renewable energy certificates also establishes a transparent and verifiable mechanism to ensure compliance, to ensure that we're successful year over year, while also facilitating financing for the resources that we need. Currently, the state does produce through the Public Utilities Commission annual compliance reporting that lays out a wealth of information about the types of resources being used, the location of those resources, what standards look like in other states. Those are all online on the PUC website, and we would expect that reporting to continue. And it also renewable energy standard can extend beyond the next decade, and we've looked at some of that information with all of you about what it will take to not just get to 100%, but to stay there as the rest of the economy begins to more rapidly decarbonize. There are limitations. The renewable energy standards in isolation are unlikely to drive the incremental and renewable generation that will be needed over the long term. And we'll need other tools, other mechanisms to ensure that we match renewable generation with real-time demand and work on improving cost effectiveness of those mechanisms and that will come in the future, as well as those that already exist. Next slide. So we established here that a critical action item for us to advance, and ideally in working with all of you and certainly our legislature, is to propose amendments necessary to result in a 100% renewable energy standard and to achieve that goal effective in 2030. We believe that we can begin to move that legislation next year. And we don't have all the details today to share with you, but we are going to work hard on that. And we'll certainly be touching base with many of you in the future to get your thoughts and perspectives on a RES design. Important to that is, one of our goals will be to maximize the value of existing long-term RECs that are already being procured, whether they're long-term contracts or through the REG program, and to leverage those on behalf of all electric distribution customers. We have here a list of principles that this recommendation maps back to, and some high-level insights based upon the analysis that we have conducted to date. This suite of slides here in the format will continue over the next several recommendations, and so you'll see that this format has been duplicated for each action. Next slide. So as I mentioned, and I think everybody at the OER team says this in every public presentation, but we cannot cost effectively achieve our future, clean energy future, without least cost procurement and robust energy efficiency and demand response. Our least cost procurement statute currently sunsets after 2023. So we think it's important that we begin now the effort to ensure that these standards and the benefits that they produce, both to the energy and energy system as well as to our economy, are extended toward the end of the decade and perhaps even beyond. It's the lowest cost means of reducing consumption and costs, and not just lower cost than fossil resources, but even lower cost than renewable resources, along with the other positive externalities that are spurred from those investments, such as supporting local businesses, investment in our buildings and communities, and significant job creation. In fact, energy efficiency currently accounts for 2/3 of the state's clean energy jobs. And we've proven the benefits, and we report on that regularly. There are some statistics here that I think are pretty eye-opening for folks. Next slide. So again, we think that the time is right to pursue an extension of the least cost procurement requirements, and in doing so, foster a bit of programmatic certainty as we plan ahead. We, in fact, have the 2021 energy efficiency plan for the state. It's currently under review by the Public Utilities Commission, and we are already starting to plan for 2022. So we work pretty hard on this, and I want to acknowledge the efforts made by National Grid in particular as the administrator of those programs. They've been tremendous partners in making Rhode Island a national leader in energy efficiency innovation, and we want to make sure that that continues. Again, we mapped this recommendation back to our guiding principles, virtually all of them, frankly. And as noted, it's important to recognize that cost-effective energy efficiency reduces the need to procure other more expensive resources, renewable or otherwise. Next slide. So I think I touched upon this a few minutes ago, but we recognize that it will be important to continue supporting not just utility scale renewable procurements, such as the recently announced effort by the governor to procure additional offshore wind, but also to continue to support local renewable development, but development that reflects evolving market conditions. Our clean energy laws seek to achieve a wide suite of objectives, including, of course, GHG reductions and environmental sustainability. We need to maintain electric system reliability. Affordability is critical, as well as spurring economic development and investment and job creation across the Rhode Island economy. But to achieve and sustain 100% renewables and advance those policy objectives, we just can't rely on one set of resources or one set of resources in one size or the other. We're going to need it all. And in doing so, we believe that the state can build a portfolio of carbon-free resources that manages cost increases, that respects equity and affordability, balances out and is realistic with other components of the utility bills, which are increasing as well, and ensure that cost effectiveness is and remains a priority across all of the policies that support these resources that are now underway. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we strongly support continued growth in local distributed generation resources, but we need to be honest about the challenges that our existing programs create, particularly when you look at accelerating growth to the levels that we're seeking to accelerate them to. And those challenges include, I think first and foremost, frankly, examining ways to reduce and control the long-term costs of building out these portfolios. Second, we recognize the need to foster and adopt more sustainable siting practices, such that we can balance renewable energy development with environmental stewardship. And we have spoken with many of the groups on this call today about why that's important. And critical to that will be collaboration with cities and towns who do control zoning and siting, state leadership, and all of you. That will be critical, we believe, to sustainable and lower risk DG development across the state. We know that we need to begin to integrate storage and other technological solutions that can smooth out production and better meet demand at different times of the day, and also improve the cost efficiency of these investments. And importantly, and we'll go into detail in a moment on this, but begin to achieve more equitable outcomes, understanding what that looks like, what we strive to achieve, how do we define it, and then how do we implement and achieve it. Next slide. A few notes here. As I stated already, we support the continuation of the REG program and net metering, but further expansion of those programs to meet our 100% goal should be contingent on the identification and integration of measures to improve those items I just walked through: sustainability, affordability, and equity. We believe that the Renewable Energy Fund should also be extended beyond its current 2022 sunset, and we should begin to evolve that tool, which work we've already started to do at OER in collaboration with Commerce, to address current market conditions and fill in gaps in the energy market. So, for example, OER has committed significant dollars to and leverage the REF framework to support incentives for renewables on brownfields. We have our first storage incentive program now underway, and soon we'll be rolling out opportunities for microgrid applications. And we also want to note that we probably don't give it enough attention in this slide deck, but supporting the clean energy workforce is also quite critical and will be beneficial long term as we accelerate renewable growth. We have a clean energy internship program underway that's been highly successful, and we want to ensure that that continues beyond the next year or two. And finally, we do recognize, and we believe it's a reality, that offshore wind is here to stay, and it will be a critical resource that needs to be leveraged to achieve these goals and all of the policy objectives that we laid out earlier. But not the only resource. And I want to be clear. I think I saw a question earlier on about maybe one stakeholder or two had some concern that we put all our eggs into one basket. That's not the case. but it is substantial because it can be built at scale. It's within proximity of the grid here, and it provides a lot of other positive externalities. So I think that's relatively consistent with the governor's call at the end of October for an additional 600 megawatts of offshore wind, and that work is now underway, and we anticipate having a draft RFP filed with the Public Utilities Commission sometime in the first quarter of 2021. Next slide. I think I covered all of these points. I think the fourth bullet is probably the one I didn't cover, which is in order to ensure that these our existing programs evolve in a manner that meets the needs of developers, of advocates, of cities and towns and state agencies and consumers. We should begin that conversation now, not wait, and try to develop a set of recommendations and potential policy changes by the end of next year. Next slide. I won't spend a lot of time here. Again, we want to map everything back to our principles, and we believe this recommendation does that for several of those principles and some analytical insights, a lot of which we walked through earlier today. Next slide. All right, let me turn it over to Dr. Carrie Gill and the OER team to walk through the planning and enabling recommendations.
Thanks so much. So planning and enabling recommendations are recommendations on ways to reduce risk, increase flexibility, and optimize renewable energy integration. The ones we have here fall into 4 buckets related to grid planning, power sector transformation, energy storage, and regional collaboration. So let's start with the grid planning recommendations on the next slide. Wonderful. So we know that our local grid must begin to more proactively consider the mid and long-term impacts of accelerated decarbonization on our distribution system and on our transmission system. Not only is it increased penetration of the renewable energy resources, but also load growth from beneficial electrification and other competing policy pressures related, for example, to siting and land use. These are 3 drivers of how and where the electric grid is built out. And so what we're proposing here with collaborative integrated grid planning is to consider these drivers in tandem and also to consider our longer time horizons, not just going out to 2030, but potentially all the way out to 2050 to better understand and plan for our future grid needs. Next slide, please. Now, we know that grid planning is highly complex. It is a very technical, multifaceted issue that lots of really smart distribution system planning engineers deal with. There are no simple solutions that are going to substantially drive down cost or advance all policy objectives at the same time. But we know that more proactive and informed planning could potentially lead to longer term grid optimization and other sorts of efficiencies that can help us advance our policy objectives. So what we're proposing to do is to conduct sort of an exploratory exercise to first understand where there may be efficiencies and then to figure out how to capitalize on those efficiencies in our grid planning. Next slide, please. We've identified 2 potential areas of exploration here, the details of which we are still trying to figure out in order to move forward in 2021. The first is to analyze our transmission and distribution system needs under several different scenarios that account for our 100% renewable electricity goal, that account for our decarbonization goals and load growth associated with those, and that account for other policy objectives. The next one that we have here is to explore how we might be able to enhance grid visibility and improve forecasting so that we have better insight into what our electric grid can handle while still providing safe, reliable, and affordable service to all of the ratepayers. Next slide, please. So our action item for 2021 is to launch a collaborative effort with National Grid, with state agencies, municipalities, and other key stakeholders to explore the potential for this integrated collaborative grid planning approach. By doing so, we will seek to identify locations that may be ripe for distributed energy resources and identify ways that we can streamline this process to incorporate distributed energy resources onto our grid. Critical to this effort, of course, will be the identification of underlying data sets necessary for more dynamic forecasting and planning. We'll need to be realistic about possible time and resources needed to gather information that's not currently in hand. But in 2021, we're proposing to move forward and to, convene the right people in the room to talk about this, to explore it further, and to take that initial step forward. Next slide, please. This maps to several of our guiding principles and to our analytical insights. We recognize that interconnection costs of distributed solar resources have risen significantly. We recognize that they are likely to continue rising without more advanced dynamic planning. We're trying to address that. We also recognize that electrification demand will require additional investments, and we're trying to figure out how to do that in the most efficient way possible in order to align with the guiding principles we've noted here. Next slide, please. So our second category of planning and enabling recommendations relates back to our power sector transformation effort in 2017. Now, this effort had 3 goals. First, to control the long-term cost of the electric system. Second, to give customers more energy choices and information. And third, to build a flexible grid to integrate more clean energy generation. Now, while this report and some initial efforts have taken place over the past couple of years, the framework here remains foundational to our work going forward. Next slide, please. So within the report, there are a number of recommendations given for how to transform our power sector in order to achieve those 3 goals I just outlined. We've listed a few specific recommendations that we look to advance here. These, of course, are very much integrated in all of the work that we're doing in all of the categories of policy recommendations that we're proposing here today. Next slide, please. The third category of recommendations has to do with building out a strategic role for energy storage. Energy storage technology will become increasingly critical to match renewable energy generation with demand and to build grid flexibility. Of course, energy storage also provides really important co-benefits like enhanced resilience. And so we're going to work in 2021 to develop a Rhode Island strategy for energy storage. This might be programmatic, this might be policy related, but we need to think ahead so that as more and more renewables come on, not just in Rhode Island, but in the other states that we're connected to in our regional electric grid, we want to be ready to make sure that we've got a flexible grid that can accommodate all of these renewable energy resources, and that can make sure that we're providing safe and reliable service. Next slide, please. Again, we've listed the guiding principles and the analytical insights here, and I think I've just covered them, so we can move to the next slide. Then the last category in planning and enabling is to continue regional collaboration, particularly on markets and transmission systems. Continued regional collaboration and coordination with other New England states to align wholesale market and transmission planning processes will help us achieve our shared clean energy goals. The governor issued, I believe a month ago, the governor was a signatory to a statement to the regional independent system operator, suggesting some ways to change and to modify the wholesale markets and transmission system planning moving forward, so that all of the New England states can best achieve the goals. The links to those documents are here in the presentation, so you'll be able to link to them afterwards, after this webinar is over. So what we're proposing is to identify and implement wholesale market mechanisms that can fully account for the value of existing and future state level investments in renewable resources, and that meet states' decarbonization mandates and maintain resource adequacy at the lowest possible cost. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So like I said, our action item for 2021 is continued coordination with other New England states. And again, we've mapped to guiding principles and analytical insights here. I believe that is the last of the planning and enabling slides. So at this point, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Yasmin Yacobi. Yasmin is a Govern for America Fellow and is the Energy Justice Program Lead for the Office of Energy Resources. Yasmin?
Thanks so much, Carrie. I'm happy to dive in here to these equity recommendations. As we noted earlier, these equity recommendations don't stand alone from the rest of these recommendations. They're meant to really center equity in the previous recommendations and give additional attention to them here to be as explicit as possible that this is something that we are taking very seriously. Next slide, please. Oh, perfect. So similar to other sections and recommendations, there are 3 buckets here, but these buckets don't stand alone. They do feed into each other and there is directionality. So the most important thing for us to start out with is partnering with trusted community organizations to listen, learn, support, and establish foundational definitions. Once we've established those partnerships, we can begin to define equity and its metrics, and then move on to improving outcomes that are identified and prioritized by those communities through rate design, program adjustments, and policies. We do want to just note that there is a long history of systemic inequities in the United States and in Rhode Island that have shaped current systems and processes. We will attempt to identify those inequities and address them whenever possible. And further, by calling out these systemic inequities and historic racism, we are hoping to start changing the narrative from solely focusing on income, which doesn't provide a full accounting of those in need, and focus on demographics, income, renter status, and other metrics that will provide more of an intersectional approach to the problem. Next slide, please. Excellent. So before we dive into the recommendations, we do want to just take a moment and gauge folks' definition of equitable outcomes. The results won't be on the screen, but even after we move off of this slide, you will still be able, the poll will stay open, so you'll be able to enter your thoughts. And I see that there's one person who's responded already, so we'll just take a couple of seconds here and then move on. And again, the poll will stay open throughout the rest of the recommendations. Excellent. I think we can move on and folks can continue to submit their thoughts as we go. So the first recommendation is to partner and listen. As we said earlier, partnering is going to be the absolute first step that is going to keep us accountable to what communities actually want. OER is already working to start to form those partnerships, but we do recognize that there is a history of mistrust between governments and communities, and so the partnership process may take a little bit longer. We're hoping to leverage existing forums to do that, improve accessibility and inclusivity of our public meetings, provide access to expert consultation as needed, provide listening sessions, which we've already started to do, and integrate equity considerations into energy efficiency plans, which we've already started to do. We're also hoping to focus on workforce development to target community-based training efforts to support in-demand clean energy jobs. We're hoping to create external education and provide education about energy programs, and continue our internal education of understanding how energy and environmental equity impact our decisions and our systems. Next slide, please. So once again, equity metrics are going to be a really important factor here. We want to make sure that we work with communities once we've partnered with them to define equity, benefits, and outcomes in this context. It'll be critical for us to, even as we're creating these partnerships and moving forward, it'll be important for us to use some of the nationally established equity metrics that are listed in the evaluation section, such as energy burden, demographic information, renter status, et cetera, so that we aren't putting equity on hold while we figure out the more specific Rhode Island-based definitions. And as we mentioned earlier, we hope to identify and track metrics focused on addressing systemic racism and historic inequities. Next slide, please. So these two next slides recognize that access to and benefit from programs and policies may not be what communities define as the most important or effective means to provide equity, but they are what we as the state have been working on thus far with our understanding. Therefore, these recommendations may change depending on if communities identify other priorities as their desired means to provide equity. But with that in mind, we're hoping to prioritize ease and make it as easy as possible for people to participate and benefit from our programs and reduce the barriers to participation in an effective and culturally competent way. We're also hoping to reduce financial burdens and to focus on consumer protection in whatever way we can. Next slide, please. And then this slide focuses on benefits, benefit from these programmatic outcomes. So making sure that energy efficiency stays a priority and that low and moderate income households and frontline communities can access energy efficiency benefits. We're also hoping to ensure equitable benefits and equitable costs. On the benefits side of things, it's not just focusing on bill savings, it's really focusing also on pollution reduction, increase to in-home comfort and health, and climate change. We did conduct a study through the Department of Energy's State Energy Strategies Grant that showed that the respondents to the survey cared equally about saving money on energy bills and also protecting animals and plants from pollution and reducing climate risks for future generations. The study is available on OER's Community Solar Marketplace if you'd be interested in checking it out. And finally, we want to make sure that we focus on beyond carve-outs. Carve-out can be the first step, but they can't be the final step to ensuring that more deserving communities can benefit from our programs. Next slide, please. Excellent. So in terms of action items, we're hoping to leverage existing forums as appropriate to identify partners, facilitate conversations, and derive guidance from future directions related to equity metrics, desired outcomes, and action items. We will, of course, partner and meet with communities to define equity, benefits, and outcomes, and these partnerships will be ongoing through the duration of this initiative. We'll also develop rules for equitable engagement and a framework for more inclusive and accessible public meetings across the energy and environmental space. And we'll be working with National Grid and other stakeholders to establish an energy efficiency equity group by 2021. And of course, all these recommendations map to our guiding principles. So with that, I think I can hand it back over to Nick.
Great, thank you, Carrie and Yasmin. Fantastic job. I hope, I know it's a lot of information today, and we only had 3 hours to do it, but you know, we hope that the information conveyed today is useful to all of our assembled stakeholders. And again, we welcome additional comment and observations over the next couple of weeks. I do want to ask quickly and put Brattle on the spot to see if they had any additional insight or observations related to the policy and programmatic recommendations just presented.
Well, I think at a high level, there's certainly nothing I disagree with in what we just heard, but as is so often the case, I think the devil is in the details. It's, you know, when you come down to sort of real world decisions about pursuing one policy approach versus another, or pursuing one particular you know, resource project versus another, and those differ on a wide variety of very different dimensions. It's not, the process gets complex. I hope that what we've done here is to raise awareness of a lot of the issues in a way that will help guide the state through those kinds of policy decisions. But I would hesitate to say that we've, you know, told you everything you need to know in order to make those decisions, because in fact they involve a lot of detail that we haven't been able to get to in this process. If there are particular issues that you'd like to discuss, I'm more than happy to take those up. But that's just my first high-level reaction.
Great, thanks. I know we had a couple of equity questions in the Q&A. Let me ask Yasmin, you know, if you want to address those now.
Sure. So I see that some folks are asking how we'll actually make sure that the right people are in the room and specifically marginalized voices are truly heard. That's what we're hoping to do by partnering with those community organizations. There are some already established community groups that serve the community and really represent their needs and have meetings monthly or weekly to hear some of those concerns. And so when we say partner, we do truly mean work with those already well-established and trusted groups to make sure that those marginalized voices who have historically not been in the room can be in the room. Additionally, we're hoping that with the equity working group that's established through National Grid and other equity working groups that we may establish in the future, that we can bring community voices, customers, and those historically marginalized communities into the room to be effectively heard. Again, this is going to be a long process and a difficult one. There is a lot of mistrust and there is a lot of work to be done to build that trust back up, but that is a priority that we're focusing on. And I see that there's also another question about the state seeing participation beyond state level policymaking, but also for individual projects that those policies spur. Again, I'm hoping that by establishing those partnerships, we can have just ongoing dialogue in the future to ensure that the folks who are being most impacted by those programs and projects are able to comment and have their voice heard, and that those projects can be really worked in tandem with those communities. Additionally, at OER specifically, we've created a tool that helps us ask questions about equity at every stage of our process, from program management to planning to evaluation to admin, et cetera. And those questions are really going to help keep us accountable to making sure that the people who need to be in the room are in the room and that we are not making assumptions about their needs.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Yasmin. I think we've covered mostly everything, and I think we've answered more than 30 questions today. We hope that our responses have been helpful. Let's go to the next slide. So we do have a post-workshop survey, and this, I have to tell you, the responses that we have received in the past 2 workshops have been extremely insightful. So I strongly encourage you to take a moment, visit that link, and fill out that post-workshop survey, which really does help us. And we actually do sit down and talk about it as a team in terms of how to improve the means by which we try to convey this information, not just for this initiative, but for all the other work that we do at OER. So thank you. Next slide. And that's it. This is our website, and we will be posting the slides in the coming days. We also relist our email address here for further public comment. And again, we have a couple of public listening sessions coming up, which are intended to be a bit more high level than the material presented today. So we hope to see some of you there, and we intend to issue our report to the governor by the end of the month. So on behalf of the OER team and the entire state project team and Brattle, I want to really thank you for your participation today and over the past couple of months. Really thank you for the insight and questions that you've asked, and for your interest in ensuring that the state is successful in achieving this very bold goal. So with that, we'll close it and wish everybody good health and safety in the days to come.
Thanks, everybody.